Hey guys, Lewis here from thelanguagescientist.com, and in today's episode we're going to talk about how to learn vocabulary. Now, this is going to be a deep dive into the science of vocabulary acquisition. I'm going to talk about three things, so three sections. Number one, I'm going to talk about the issues that happen the most often according to the science when learning vocabulary, so like the major obstacles. Then I'm going to talk about intentional learning of vocabulary, so what kind of activities you have to do to intentionally learn vocabulary. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about incidental learning of vocabulary. So incidental means you do activities for language learning, but it's not necessarily like vocabulary lists or anything like that. It's just you're learning vocabulary incidentally, and we're gonna see in what way incidental vocabulary learning is actually useful. Well, actually, it's necessary to complement intentional learning of vocabulary. All right, first, I want to start this episode just by saying that this is going to be a deep dive. This is going to be a long episode, and you can find this on, I guess I'm going to release a podcast format for this, but yeah, it's going to be pretty long. So first, let me acknowledge first that learning vocabulary is the main challenge of mastering a second language. I've talked about that in the past. People tend to be overly worried about pronunciation and grammar, but really vocabulary is by far the most difficult aspect of language learning, just because of the sheer volume, just the number of words and phrases and different aspects of words and different contexts in which you can find certain words and certain phrases. There's so much stuff that you need to learn. And so this is why vocabulary is the most challenging part of language learning. Now, the best means of achieving good vocabulary learning are still unclear, partly because it depends on a wide variety of factors. And so teachers and learners have been sort of unsure and left in the dark as far as the best way to learn vocabulary. And textbooks and classroom programs have been somewhat negligent in providing clear instructions as far as how to go about vocabulary learning. Now, fortunately for us, there's actually a substantial research that has been done on vocabulary learning, and unfortunately it's just that a lot of it has not made it to mainstream language learning and pedagogy. And even now on the internet, on YouTube and so on, it's still, a lot of people are still talking about their own experiences only. I've been guilty of this, certainly, but now all of the science is there. It's been there for a long time, and I'm just going to put it out there so you know how to learn vocabulary faster and better. So this episode is just for that. I'm going to give you a broad overview of dozens of scientific papers that have been published. In the objective here is to give you the tools that you need to learn vocabulary as best as possible. So the first part is going to be the issues of learning vocabulary. And so the first issue that the science shows us is the problem of form. So the first step when you try to acquire vocabulary is establishing some sort of initial form and meaning link. And so this is what most vocabulary exercises and material tries to do. But the common assumption seems to be that learning the meaning of words and phrases is of key importance, while the form element is somewhat downplayed. And so meaning is very simple. Meaning is the meaning of the word, and form is more like what does the word look like, and the spelling and all of these things. So the result of somewhat neglecting form is that similar words are very confusing for people, especially words with that are similar except for their endings. For example, like comprehensive and comprehensible. For English learners, this is very confusing. This can be very confusing according to the research. And other words with similar sort of structures but different vowels, like adopt and adapt. The meaning is vastly different, but they sort of look the same, and English learners have been confused, can confuse those words very easily. So that's one issue that I'm going to talk a little bit more in this episode. Now, another issue that comes up in the scientific literature is the problem of L1. Now, just to give you some background here, in the scientific literature, L1 is referring to your native language, language 1, and L2, it's your second language. It's the second language that you're trying to learn. It could be a third language, doesn't matter. It's like the foreign language, the language that you're trying to learn. So there is an issue here because one reason that people can learn their L1 so easily is that their minds actually become progressively attuned to the features of their L1 as they grow up as kids. And so people become attuned to the particular set of phonemes and graphemes in their native language and the ways in which they combine. So phonemes and graphemes, I realize that most people don't understand what these are. So phonemes are the perceptually distinct units of sound in a specific language that distinguish words from one another. So for example, P, B, D, and T in the English words like pad, pat, bad, and bat. All right, and the graphemes are the written symbols that represent a sound. So this can be a single letter, or it could be a sequence of letters such as AI, SH, IGH, TCH, etc. So just a little bit of technical knowledge here. It's not very, very important, but the point is your brain gets specialized in processing your L1, and so this could cause problems when you attempt to process a foreign language in the same way, and this is what people tend to do. So for example, there's a major difference in which like English speakers mainly they understand that there are separate words in a sentence using stress. So they parse in English. You parse a discourse using the stress in specific phrases, while in French, which is my native language, in French we rely more on syllable cues. That's not something that we think about intentionally, but that's what happens. So this is a problem. That's the second problem. Now, I'm going to talk about the third problem now, which is the question of should you use your L1 for learning your L2? So should you use your native language when trying to learn vocabulary words in another language? And so a few studies have actually shown that L1 translations, using L1 translations is more effective than providing L2 based meanings. So for example, if you're learning Chinese and you have a word or a phrase in Chinese, then it's more effective to just translate that word in your native language, in English, for example, rather than trying to find another sort of Chinese phrase that explains that Chinese word. I know that when I was in high school, that was kind of some teachers would do that. I'm not really sure what the objective was, but there are a few studies showing that actually using L1 translations is more effective. So it's certainly not criminal. It actually seems to be better. There are also other arguments, psycholinguistic arguments, why the establishment of this form meaning link might actually benefit from the use of your native language. It's been hypothesized that this initial link consists of the new the new word that you're trying to learn, and that word is attached to a representation of the corresponding L1 word, which already exists in memory. So by using your L1 to learn your L2, then you're doing this link in your memory. So this is actually a pretty good way to go about it. Now, let me talk about engagement with vocabulary. So this issue here has to do with the question of, well, what is the best approach when trying to learn vocabulary in a foreign language? So I think it's pretty common sense, and people are probably going to agree when I say that the more you engage with a new word, the more likely you are to learn it. And there have been a lot of attempts to sort of formalize this notion a little bit more precisely. So an example is Craig and Lockhart's in 1972. They published a paper about depth and levels of processing in a language. So it's a hypothesis, the depth and levels of processing hypothesis. And I've talked about this, I've talked about depth of mental processing in the past. That's what I was referring to. Excuse me, but essentially this hypothesis sort of laid the basic groundwork by stating that the more attention that you give to an item and the more manipulation is involved with this item, then the greater the chances that it will be, remembered. Now, this notion has been refined a little bit further by, and I'm probably going to butcher their names, but Holzchen and Laufer in 2001. And so they redefined that notion further and suggested that the involvement for vocabulary learning consists of three components: need, search, and evaluation. So these are the three components that sort of determine how well you can remember a specific, lexical item. And by the way, I'm going to use the term lexical item in in today's episode. That's one term that is used very commonly in the research, but that's basically saying, a lexical item is like a vocabulary item. So need, search, and evaluation, that's another sort of hypothesis. And so need is the requirement for that particular, lexical item in order to achieve some tasks, such as, needing to know a word to understand a book or something like that. Search is the attempt to find the required information, for example, looking up that word in the dictionary. Evaluation refers to comparing that word or, information about a word with the context of use to determine whether it's a good fit. And so, need, search, and evaluation, those are components that really matter when learning vocabulary. And the authors of that hypothesis have found support to, support that hypothesis. Now, to be honest, when you look at the scientific literature, need, search, and evaluation are not the only factors that seem to actually play a role when trying to determine what factors are really important when trying to learn vocabulary. There are many, many other things. So, for example, increased frequency of exposure, increased attention focused on the vocabulary, increased noticing of that vocabulary, increased intention to learn that vocabulary, a requirement to learn that vocabulary, for a test, for example, a need to use that vocabulary, increased manipulation of that vocabulary, increased amount of times spent engaging with that vocabulary, and amount of interaction spent with that vocabulary. So overall, as you can see, there are lots of factors that can come into play and help you remember vocabulary better. And so more exposure, more attention, more manipulation, more time spent on that vocabulary is beneficial. In essence, what you should get away from this is that anything that leads to more and better engagement should improve vocabulary learning. And so promoting more engagement is the fundamental task as a language learner. You need to increase and better your engagement with that vocabulary. And I'm going to get into specific strategies that you can use a little bit later when talking about intentional learning of vocabulary and incidental learning of vocabulary. All right, let me talk about the next issue, which is it's very simple. I think most people are actually wondering about this phrasal vocabulary. So is it better to actually learn vocabulary by focusing on individual words, or is it better to focus on entire phrases? Now, there is some evidence showing that phrasal vocabulary can be better than just teaching or learning single words. And this is what I have been doing for many years, focusing on learning sentences as opposed to single words. I've been doing this because I didn't really know the research on it, but it just made sense to me, to be honest. And it's also very practical because the way I do it, I learn a lot with Netflix and making flashcards using Netflix shows. And naturally, Netflix, it's like TV shows, they're entire sentences. I'm not going to say much more about this apart from the fact that there are very few drawbacks to learning with phrases as opposed to learning with single words. Apart from the fact that I think, and this is not necessarily something that I read in the research, but if you're learning, single words, your attention tends to be a lot more focused on that single word. Whereas when you have a phrase, it's very easy to sort of, for your attention to be a little bit more dispersed and a little bit less focused on perhaps, the meaning of that specific word and certainly its form. All right, now let me move on to the last issue that I want to talk about when it comes to learning vocabulary. So receptive versus productive vocabulary. So, language learners have a larger receptive vocabulary than productive vocabulary. So what I mean by this is that receptive vocabulary is the words and phrases that you can understand. And so, when it comes as an input, you can actually understand it. And productive vocabulary is, the set of words and phrases that you can actually produce yourself, so output. So receptive vocabulary is usually a lot larger than the productive vocabulary. So for example, a study by Laufer in 2005, again, I'm probably butchering that name, reported that productive to receptive ratios are around 16% at the 5,000 frequency level. So it means that the 5,000 most common word families, then most learners are probably going to be able to understand those 5,000 word families, but only going to be able to produce 16% of them. So the ratios, that 16% ratio is highly dependent on the type of tests used during the studies. But the point here is that it seems that acquiring productive vocabulary is a lot more difficult than acquiring receptive vocabulary. I think that does not come as a surprise. So the implication is that it cannot be assumed that productive vocabulary will automatically follow from, receptive mastery of certain words and phrases. And, in fact, I would even say that it seems that productive vocabulary, if you need that, which most people need that to have conversations and, write stuff, then you need to engage in productive tasks for this vocabulary to be developed. So just receiving input and doing receptive exposure does not seem to be enough to reliably lead to productive mastery. And so you need to do structured productive practice. All right, so that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about when talking about issues of vocabulary learning. And now in the next part, I'm going to talk about intentional learning of vocabulary and some strategies. And then after that, we're going to get into incidental learning of vocabulary. All right, so now I want to talk about the second part, which is intentional learning of vocabulary. So, by intentional, I mean just learning vocabulary explicitly. So, the currently favored language teaching sort of paradigm is a focus on meaning-based learning, meaning that the vocabulary and in general language features are learned by using them and encountering them, when reading, when listening to things, rather than actually, explicitly focusing on them. And so there are very good reasons to believe that vocabulary actually requires a different approach. It's not that, meaning-based learning is useless. It's actually very useful. I'm going to talk about that in the incidental learning of vocabulary part of this episode. But with regards to vocabulary specifically, it requires a different approach, which also incorporates explicit attention to learning that vocabulary. So here are some of the reasons why this is actually necessary. First of all, if you understand an overall message, if you read something, if you listen to something, you often do not pay attention to the precise meanings of individual words. Another reason is that if you try to guess from context, which is one of the ways in which, one method for learning languages, when you're reading something and some of the words are unfamiliar to you, you try to guess from context and, you can learn from that. But guessing from context is often unreliable. I'm going to talk about that later in the incidental learning part. And that's especially true if you do not know at least 98% of the words in whatever text it is that you're reading. That's what the research has shown. To be able to guess from context, you need to know a very high percentage of the words, in the text, 98%. Another reason is that words which are easily guessed or just understood from context may not generate enough sort of engagement to be learned and actually be remembered in the long term. And finally, the last reason why you need to use explicit sort of learning methods as opposed to just, learning words from input is because new words which learners have met in this course need to be met again, relatively quickly to avoid being forgotten. So you need to cement them in your long-term memory. So in order for words to be met 10 times in reading, for example, learners need to read 1 to 2 graded readers per week. And the typical person learning a language on their own, they do not have that much time. They don't read this much. They may not have access to those graded readers. So these are the reasons why you should incorporate explicit learning of vocabulary as opposed to just relying on incidental learning of vocabulary through input. Now, the main reason why you should have an explicit focus on the vocabulary is just because it is very effective and efficient. Research has shown, as I will talk about later, that valuable learning can occur from incidental exposure, to vocabulary, but intentional vocabulary learning, so that is activities whose specific goal is to learn vocabulary, almost always lead to greater and faster gains. So given the relative effectiveness of those explicit activities, such as, the flashcards in Link, for example, or, anywhere in Anki, for example, that kind of approach, you would think that would be a major sort of component, a major element in most classrooms. But this is not necessarily the case. In the research I've seen, there are case studies in Asia where they show, they sort of research the percentage of words that are taught explicitly versus those that are taught, incidentally. And so, for example, in Hong Kong, about 2.79% of the words are taught explicitly, only 2.79%. In China, 12.24%. That's a lot more, but that is still the minority of words. So then you may think, well, okay, but just listening to your teacher speak, in your target language, that may be useful. It turns out that actually teachers may not actually use many vocabulary words naturally in their lessons. They're not using at least new words. And so there's a study on that by Lightbound and Halter in 1997. They found that teachers from both audiolingual and communicative approaches used only 2.75 new words per 500 words of speech. So, if you're just relying on listening to your teacher, well, you're not going to encounter a lot of new words. So it's very difficult to say that any activity is better than other activities, because vocabulary learning is multifaceted. It's really complicated. The language acquisition process is very complex, but the vocabulary, the research has shown that there are a number of principles for selecting and essentially selecting effective tasks. And one thing I want to redirect you to is the research by Paul Nation. I'm not necessarily going to talk about this in great depth here, but there is a free ebook that you can find on the internet. You can look for, I think it's go on Google and type Paul Nation, Nation like Nation, and look for what every language learner needs to know or something like that. It's a very short sort of 50-page ebook that presents sort of all of the activities that you can use to learn a language, and a lot of it is focused on vocabulary learning, and it's like the 4 strands of Paul Nation. So I think the 4 strands pretty much summarize that vocabulary research pretty well. Although it's not entirely focused on vocabulary, I think Paul Nation is very well aware that vocabulary is a major challenge in vocabulary learning. All right, so as far as what it is that you should do, like what types of activities should you select to learn a maximum, like a lot of vocabulary? Well, you should use activities that maximize your engagement with some target words. And so this is, maximizing engagement, as I've, said a few minutes ago. This is a key principle in vocabulary learning. One of, personally, my favorite way of doing this is using Anki, so a spaced repetition system. You can also use LINQ. Again, I'll put a link to LINQ in the description of this video, but the point is that those 2 applications have flashcard systems. And so the point here is that you're going to get engagement with target words. So by target words, one thing that you could do, for example, is that if you're a beginner in the language, it's very useful to actually focus on frequency lists. So if you're a beginner, if you can learn like the 2,000 most common words in the language, you're going to get up to a fairly good level pretty quickly, because you're tackling the most important stuff first. So I'm not going to show how to do this in detail, but I put a link to LINQ, and Anki, you can just type it on the internet. It's ANKI. All right, so the second principle here that I want to talk about is maximizing repeated exposures to the target vocabulary. So not only should you try to learn vocabulary, but you should also, and this is equally important, or even more important, is you need to recycle the vocabulary that you have learned. So it's repeated exposure and recycling. So it's difficult for the research to prescribe exactly the number of repetitions necessary to learn a word or a phrase, but because it depends on sort of the level of engagement and the type of measure used in the research. But Paul Nation, so the researcher, the professor Paul Nation, actually has an overview of a number of studies, and that overview gives us a rough idea. So if you can actually get repeated exposure to the same lexical item from 5 to more than 20 repeated meetings, then that corresponds to sort of the the criterion where most research would consider that word actually learned. So the important point here, I don't want you to necessarily focus on the number of times that you need to review a word. You need to understand that recycling is necessary, and it's very, very important. And if you neglect it, many partially learned word will actually be forgotten. And so this is a waste of all the efforts that you put into learning all of those words in the first place. So if you learn words, you need to review them. Otherwise, you just lose that benefit of initially learning them. As a matter of fact, Professor Nation argues that it is even more important to consolidate previously learned words than actually teach new words because of the time investment. So recycling has to be consciously built into your program. This is very important. This is what I do myself. Instead of trying to learn new words all the time, I actually try to focus more on reviewing. If I don't have time to learn new words, I'm at least going to do my reviews. And so you can use a link for that. You can use Anki, doesn't matter. So from the memory research that we have, we know that most forgetting of new words actually occur soon after the learning session, and then it sort of slows down. So the first recyclings are particularly important to recycle those words and keep them in your long-term memory. And so you need to do those first recyclings fairly quickly. Now, the last point I want to touch on for intentional vocabulary learning is you need to consider which aspects of lexical knowledge you want to focus on. So it seems that most vocabulary tasks actually focus their attention almost entirely on introducing the meaning of new words. But that's a pretty narrow view of vocabulary, and it doesn't take into account the sort of incremental nature of vocabulary learning. So for example, Professor Nation, in a study in 2001, suggested, as I said, a 4-part, or he calls it a 4-strand approach, which gives balanced attention to learning information about vocabulary and then provides consolidation and enhancement of that vocabulary. Because it's not because you just learn the word for your flashcard, you know it for sure. No, there are multiple aspects to that word, depends on the context, depends on the use. So the 4 strands are here for that. And the 4 strands are, and I'm going to describe them in detail, but let me just give you an overview. The first strand is meaning-focused input. The second strand is meaning-focused output. Then you have language-focused learning, and then you have fluency development. I've talked about this perhaps in less detail in the past, so let me give you some details. The first strand is meaning-focused input. So this first strand actually, there's an acknowledgement of the benefits of learning vocabulary through reading and listening to vocabulary words in, meaningful and, if possible, interesting context. So this is just, reading and listening to stuff with new words. This is actually useful. I'm going to talk about this in more detail later. But the second strand, meaning-focused output, vocabulary learning actually occurs as well when people try to communicate messages to other people. This is sort of linked to what I talked about, receptive versus productive vocabulary. The third strand is language-focused learning. This strand corresponds more closely to sort of traditional vocabulary teaching. So it's like explicit attention on lexical items. And the reasoning behind this strand is that some vocabulary, specifically like high-frequency items, it's really necessary for any kind of language use, like the most frequent words. So it's worth actually the effort to teach them explicitly through frequency lists, for example. So because it's going to be much more effective than just trying to meet those words, incidentally in text or through listening. And then finally, the final strand, which is fluency development. This is something that not a lot of people think about, but, fluency development, it's essentially, I think it's self-evident that knowledge of vocabulary is only of value if you can actually recognize that vocabulary or produce it in a timely manner that enables sort of natural language use. So there's a time component to this last strand of fluency development. So one example of this is reading. If the vocabulary recognition is too slow, then that reading turns into a very slow decoding process, and so it's impossible to understand the flow of the text. In the same way, if you're trying to speak and you know the words, but they don't, you can't produce them in a timely manner, it's very problematic to have conversations with people. So the last strand of fluency development is focused on this aspect of, producing or recognizing or getting language and doing it in a timely manner. It's all about time. All right, now let me get to the last part of this very long video. I'm going to talk about incidental learning of vocabulary. Now, although engagement rich, explicit exposure is, I've talked about it, it's more effective. Explicit learning of vocabulary, it is more effective. There's no doubt about this. There are limitations in the number of times that, you can get exposed to certain, lexical items. So this means that, many of the meetings, many of the times that you try to learn vocabulary from, explicit exposure, well, it's not going to be enough to actually learn all of the aspects of, certain vocabulary items. So you need to get a lot of input for reading and listening. This is actually, for example, if you're listening to something, it's very easy to get a lot of vocabulary in. And even though it's not as time efficient, it's very easy because you're just listening. And the same thing goes for reading, maybe a bit less because you actually need to sit down and read. All right, so let me just compare a little bit the effectiveness of incidental vocabulary learning. First, I'm going to talk about incidental vocabulary learning that comes from reading. So overall, the research confirms that worthwhile vocabulary learning does occur from reading. It does happen, but the pickup rate is pretty low, and it seems to be difficult to really gain a productive, so producing the language, it seems to be difficult to gain a productive level of mastery just from, exposure from reading. So there was a study in 2003 from Hill and Laufer that estimates that at the rates of incidental learning reported in many studies, if you want to learn 2,000 words, then you would have to read over 8 million words of text. So that's about 420 novels to just get, 2,000 words. So clearly this is a daunting prospect, and so it's probably best not to rely upon incidental learning as your primary source of, trying to learn new words. But incidental learning seems to be better at enhancing knowledge of words that have already been met or learned through explicit learning, for example. So another another sort of good aspect of sort of trying to read your way to fluency is that I've already established that repetition is key to learning new words, and so the benefits of repeated exposures in different contexts, depending on the text, for consolidating fragile initial learning, it's actually pretty great in that sense to actually read text and get input. So definitely reading is part of the process. This is not necessarily something that you want to use to learn a ton of new words, but enhancing your knowledge of the words that you already know and putting them into context. These are some of the benefits of reading. Now, let me talk about incidental learning from listening. So most of the research has focused on incidental learning that comes from reading and not on listening. But now there is now beginning to be some research on the incidental acquisition of vocabulary from listening. So most of it actually points to a pretty low pickup rate as well. Just like for reading. So on average, most target words seem to move from a state of being totally unknown to a state where the learners actually recognize having heard that word, but they don't necessarily know what it means. So listening can be a useful supplement to reading, because studies have found that reading while listening is generally superior to just reading when it comes to vocabulary learning. Now, more generally here, I just want to comment that my own experience is that while you're not going to learn a lot of new words from listening, you shouldn't count on that, directly. What you should do is do explicit learning of vocabulary. So do things like, for example, Link has this flashcard feature, or you can do vocabulary lists, you can do Anki. Learn the words explicitly from, for example, a Netflix show or something. And once you've learned those words, then you can listen to that Netflix episode or that podcast or that YouTube video. And so by re-listening just like that, you're getting the benefits from hearing the word in context and actually used with the pronunciation and so on, and you're getting repeated exposure. So like the recycling that is so important for learning the word in the long term. All right, now let me talk about another aspect of incidental learning of vocabulary. This is extensive reading. Now, one way of incorporating incidental learning into your language learning program is to organize some sort of extensive reading component. By extensive reading, I mean the research just says that it's like basically just reading a lot of stuff. And so the thing here is that the reader needs to know about 98% of the words in that text. So a lot of the authentic texts like novels in whatever language you're trying to learn, that's not going to be suitable for you. It's only going to be for advanced learners. So another interesting thing here is that although I have talked about vocabulary learning with reading, and the pickup rates are pretty low, research has shown that substantial vocabulary learning can actually be derived from graded readers. So just in case you don't know, I've mentioned graded readers a little bit earlier, but graded readers are, for example, novels that have been adapted to the appropriate level. So for example, if you're a beginner, there are novels, for example, in Chinese with very beginner words and beginner sentence constructs and so on that can help you to learn Chinese. So yes, that can be actually useful. To me, I just don't, reading the research, I don't really understand. There's sort of this contrast here. It's a little bit, I guess, the research contradicts itself a little bit, in the sense that a lot of research shows that, reading if you're trying to learn vocabulary from reading, you're going to have a low pickup rate, so you're not going to pick up a lot of new words. But at the same time, graded readers are very effective. So, I suppose that maybe the research on reading with low pickup rates is like, if you're trying to learn with texts that are way too hard for you, then you're not going to pick up a lot of new words. Whereas, with graded readers, because they're at the right level, then you're going to learn a lot more new words. All right, now let me talk about the last aspect of incidental vocabulary learning I wanted to talk about, which is inferencing from context. So inferencing from context, or guessing from context, is a pretty popular strategy for language learners, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's effective. There is a paper from Nasagi in 2003 that found that out of 199 guesses, learners only made 51 that were successful, so that's 25.6%, and another 37 were partially successful, so 18.6%. So this low success rate is similar to the 24% rate that another study in 1984 from Ben-Susan and Laufers found. So, learners are essentially not as good as they think at guessing from context. And one of the reasons for this poor rate of success when trying to guess words from context is that learners actually confuse unknown words for words which they already know that have a similar spelling or similar form. And so this is another point, another argument that goes for the importance of focusing on form when learning vocabulary. All right, so this is pretty much all I wanted to talk about with regards to vocabulary learning. It's clear in conclusion that you need to do intentional and incidental learning. It's not it's complementary. Not only that, but it actually, you need to do both. There's no doubt about this. You need to do explicit vocabulary learning because it's more time effective, and you need to do incidental learning because there's no way that you're going to get everything that you need just from explicit vocabulary learning. So it's impossible in explicit learning, for example, to recycle words adequately and to teach all of the context and the types of word knowledge that you need. So it's just time constraint and just the difficulty of teaching the different word contexts. So exposure to a great deal of reading and listening is necessary for consolidation and enhancement of everything that you learn explicitly. So, and then, conversely, words acquired by incidental learning are unlikely to be learned to a productive level, and the pickup rates are low. And so the additional attention that comes from intentional learning may be required to push them to a higher level of mastery. All right, so that's pretty much it. I hope that you learned a lot from this episode. It was pretty long, but as I said, it was a deep dive.